I never thought I'd be the kind of person to fake a marriage for money. But when you're drowning in debt and someone offers you a lifeline that could save not just yourself, but your dying mother, you don't think twice. You just grab it and hope you don't drown anyway. My name is Emma, and 6 months ago, I made the most reckless decision of my life. I married a complete stranger for $2 million. What I didn't expect was that by the end of it all, I'd be questioning everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and what makes a marriage real. It started on the worst day of my life. I was sitting in the hospital waiting room, clutching a stack of bills I couldn't pay, watching my mother sleep through the window of her ICU room. The experimental treatment that could save her life cost more money than I'd see in 10 lifetimes. I was a struggling art teacher living paycheck to paycheck, and the insurance company had just denied our appeal for the 3rd time. That's when he walked into my life, like something out of a fever dream. "Miss Sullivan?" I looked up to see a man in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my rent. He was tall, with dark hair and the kind of sharp jawline you see in magazines. But it was his eyes that caught me off guard, gray, calculating, and surprisingly gentle as they took in my tear-stained face. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" I wiped my cheeks hastily, embarrassed to be caught at my lowest point by someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a boardroom. "Alexander Blackwood," he said, extending his hand. The name meant nothing to me then, but the way he said it suggested it should. "I have a proposition that might interest you." I almost laughed. "Unless you're here to tell me you're secretly a doctor who works for free. I doubt it." He sat down beside me without invitation, his presence somehow both commanding and comforting. "I need a wife. You need money. I think we can help each other." The words hung in the air between us like something tangible. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" "My grandfather left me his entire estate in his will. But there's a catch." Alexander's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "I have to be married before my 30th birthday, which is in 6 months, or everything goes to my cousin Marcus." "That's $3 billion, Miss Sullivan." The number was so large it didn't even feel real. "And you want to marry?" "Me? Why?" "Because you're perfect for this arrangement. You need money urgently, and you have no connections to my world. No ulterior motives beyond what we both openly acknowledge." He pulled out a card and wrote something on the back. $2 million. 1-year marriage contract. Completely platonic, of course. After the inheritance is secured, we divorce quietly, and you never see me again. I stared at the card in his hand, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. $2 million, enough to save my mother and start over completely. How do I know this isn't some elaborate scam? Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. A quick Google search of his name brought up dozens of photos, charity galas, business magazines, society pages. Alexander Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune, one of the most eligible bachelors in the country. And here he was, sitting in a hospital waiting room, proposing to a complete stranger. "I've already had my lawyers draft the paperwork. Everything is legal and binding." You'll be protected every step of the way." His gray eyes met mine. "What do you say? Miss Sullivan, will you marry me?" I should have said no. I should have walked away from the impossibly handsome stranger with his impossible offer. But when I looked through that window at my mother, hooked up to machines that were keeping her alive, the word that came out of my mouth was different entirely. Yes, the wedding was nothing like I'd ever dreamed my wedding would be. No white dress, no flowers, no family. Just me in my best dress, a navy blue thing I'd bought for job interviews, standing in a courthouse next to a man I'd known for exactly 1 week. Alexander had insisted we spend that week getting to know basic facts about each other, favorite foods, childhood memories, the kinds of details a real couple would know. It felt like the strangest job interview of my life. Vanilla ice cream, I told him over coffee at an expensive cafe I could never normally afford. I know it's boring, but it's my favorite. It's not boring, it's classic. He made a note in his phone. Mine's mint chocolate chip, in case anyone asks. Do you have any siblings? I asked, stirring my latte and trying to ignore how his fingers looked wrapped around his coffee cup. Just Marcus, my cousin. He's complicated. Alexander's jaw tightened. He's been expecting to inherit everything since we were children. This marriage isn't going to make me popular with that side of the family. I wanted to ask more, but something in his expression warned me off the topic. We were business partners, I reminded myself. Nothing more. The judge who married us was kind but efficient. Do you, Alexander James Blackwood, take Emma Catherine Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was steady, professional. Do you, Emma Catherine Sullivan, take Alexander James Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband? The words stuck in my throat for a moment. This wasn't real, I told myself. This was just a business arrangement. But when I looked into Alexander's gray eyes, something fluttered in my chest that had nothing to do with business. I do. He slipped a ring onto my finger, a simple platinum band that somehow fit perfectly. Later, I would learn he'd had it sized based on a photo he'd taken of my hands during one of our coffee meetings. The attention to detail should have felt calculated, but instead, it felt oddly thoughtful. You may kiss the bride. We both froze. Somehow, in all our planning, we hadn't discussed this part. Alexander's eyes searched mine for permission, and I gave the smallest nod. His lips touched mine briefly, barely more than a whisper of contact, but I felt it everywhere. And just like that, I was Mrs. Alexander Blackwood. The first surprise came when Alexander pulled up to his house, or rather, his mansion. I'd known he was wealthy, but seeing the sprawling estate with its manicured gardens and fountain in the circular driveway made my new reality hit home. This wasn't just different from my world. It was from another planet entirely. Welcome home, Alexander said, and something in his voice made me think he was as nervous as I was. This is where you live? I stepped out of his sleek black car, craning my neck to take in the full scope of the building. It's enormous. Family house. I grew up here. He picked up my single suitcase, everything I owned fit into one bag, and started toward the front door. "You'll have the entire East Wing to yourself. We shouldn't have to see each other much, except for public appearances." That stung more than it should have. Right, of course. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, was waiting for us in the foyer. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a neat bun. If she thought it was strange that her employer had suddenly appeared with a wife, she didn't show it. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said warmly, and I started before realizing she was talking to me. "Welcome. I've prepared the blue room for you." The blue room turned out to be larger than my entire apartment. It had a sitting area, a walk-in closet that echoed when I stepped inside, and a bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens. "If you need anything at all, just ring," Mrs. Henderson said, pointing to an honest-to-God servant's bell by the bed. When she left, I sat on the edge of the four-poster bed and tried to process what I'd done. 24 hours ago, I was Emma Sullivan, struggling teacher. Now I was Emma Blackwood, wife of a billionaire, living in a house that could probably house half my neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Sarah. "How's your mom doing? Call me when you can." I'd told everyone that I'd gotten a loan from a private investor to pay for Mom's treatment. The truth was too complicated, too unbelievable. Who would believe that I'd married a stranger for money? It sounded like something out of a trashy romance novel. The treatment had begun immediately. The doctors were optimistic, and for the first time in months, I'd seen real hope in my mother's eyes. Whatever else happened, I'd done the right thing. I had to believe that. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in." Alexander entered, looking oddly formal in his own home. He'd changed out of his suit into dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that made his eyes look even grayer. "I wanted to discuss the schedule for this week. There are a few events we need to attend together to make this look authentic." He handed me a tablet with our calendar pulled up. Charity gala on Thursday, business dinner Friday, brunch with his grandmother on Sunday. "Your grandmother?" I looked up at him in alarm. "We're meeting family already?" She insisted. Grandmother is persistent. She's also very good at reading people, so we'll need to be convincing. Alexander sat in the chair across from me, careful to maintain distance. "She'll want to know how we met, how long we've been together, that sort of thing." "What do we tell her?" "The truth, mostly. We met at the hospital. I was there visiting a friend." He lied smoothly. "And I saw you in the waiting room. I couldn't stop thinking about you." The way he said it, with that slight smile and soft voice, almost made me believe it myself. And I said yes because despite my reputation, you saw something in me worth taking a chance on. His eyes met mine. "It's not entirely untrue." Something warm spread through my chest at his words, but I pushed it down. This was acting, nothing more. "We'll need to work on being comfortable with each other physically." Alexander continued. "Small touches, holding hands, that sort of thing." Nothing inappropriate, but enough to convince people we're actually married. Right. Physical comfort. I nodded, trying to sound professional. We should practice. He stood and held out his hand. I stared at it for a moment before placing mine in his. His fingers were warm, slightly rough despite his obvious wealth, and they closed around mine with surprising gentleness. This feels awkward, I supplied. I was going to say natural. He looked down at our joined hands with an expression I couldn't read. We should probably practice other things too. Dancing, for instance. There will be several formal events. I should probably warn you that I'm not exactly ballroom trained. I'll teach you. He tugged gently on my hand, pulling me to my feet. May I have this dance, Mrs. Blackwood? There was no music, but Alexander began to move anyway, guiding me in a simple waltz around my ridiculously large bedroom. His hand settled on my waist, warm through the thin fabric of my dress, and suddenly the air felt charged. "Step back on your right foot," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Good. Now to the side." We moved together in the quiet room, and I found myself getting lost in the rhythm, in the solid warmth of his chest under my palm, in the way he smelled like expensive cologne and something indefinably masculine. "You're a natural," he said softly. I looked up to find his face much closer than I'd expected. Those gray eyes were focused on my lips, and for a wild moment, I thought he might kiss me again. Really kiss me this time. But then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "I think that's enough practice for tonight. Good night, Emma." He was gone before I could respond, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the room, my heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the dancing. This was going to be more complicated than I'd thought. The charity gala was my first real test as Mrs. Alexander Blackwood, and I was terrified. Alexander had arranged for a stylist to come to the house, and the woman had transformed me into someone I barely recognized. The dress was midnight blue silk that hugged my curves and fell to the floor in elegant waves. My hair was swept up in an intricate chignon, and the makeup was flawless, but still looked like me. Just the best version of me I'd ever seen. "You look stunning," Alexander said when I met him at the top of the staircase. He was wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo that made him look like he'd stepped out of a James Bond movie. "I feel like I'm playing dress up." "You look like you were born to wear that dress." He offered me his arm. Ready to convince the world we're madly in love? The gala was held at the city's most exclusive hotel, and as we walked into the ballroom, I felt every eye in the room turn to us. Alexander's hand settled possessively on my lower back, and he leaned down to whisper in my ear, "Breathe, sweetheart. You're doing perfectly." The endearment sent shivers down my spine, but I reminded myself it was all part of the act. "Alexander Blackwood, you dog!" A booming voice interrupted my thoughts. A heavy-set man with thinning hair approached us with a wide grin. "When were you going to tell us you'd gotten married?" "Charles, I'd like you to meet my wife. Emma. This is Charles Morrison, old family friend." I smiled and shook his hand, trying to channel every etiquette lesson I'd ever learned. "It's lovely to meet you. The pleasure is all mine, you know." Alexander. Your cousin Marcus was just saying he thought you'd never settle down. This must have come as quite a shock to him. Something flickered across Alexander's face. I'm sure it did. Speaking of Marcus, there he is now. Charles waved across the room. Marcus, come meet Alexander's wife. I turned to see a man approaching who looked like a darker version of Alexander. Same height, same build, but where Alexander's features were sharp and noble, Marcus's had a cruel cast. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he looked me over like I was a piece of property. So this is the mysterious Mrs. Blackwood. Marcus's voice was smooth, but there was something unpleasant underneath. How fascinating that we're just meeting now. Emma and I preferred to keep things private, Alexander said, his arm tightening around my waist. How wonderfully romantic. Tell me, Emma, how long have you two been seeing each other? The question felt like a test. About 8 months, I said, sticking to our rehearsed story. 8 months? And you never mentioned her to the family? Marcus's eyebrows rose. That doesn't sound like you, cousin. People change, Alexander said evenly. Indeed they do. Marcus's smile was sharp, especially when there's something significant to gain. The tension was thick enough to cut, and I found myself stepping closer to Alexander instinctively. His hand moved to cover mine where it rested on his arm, a gesture that felt protective and real. If you'll excuse us, Alexander said. I promised my wife a dance. He led me away before Marcus could respond, but I could feel the other man's eyes following us across the room. He knows, I whispered as Alexander pulled me into his arms on the dance floor. Marcus suspects everyone of having ulterior motives because that's how his mind works. Alexander's hand settled on my waist, and we began to move to the music. Don't let him get to you. Is he going to be a problem? Probably. Alexander's honesty was refreshing, if not comforting. But we knew this wouldn't be easy. As we danced, I became aware of the other couples around us, the way they moved together with easy familiarity. Alexander and I looked the part, but there was still a careful distance between us, an awareness that we were performing rather than simply being. Can I ask you something? I said as he spun me elegantly under his arm. Anything. Why me? Really? There must have been hundreds of women who would have agreed to this arrangement. Alexander was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. Because when I saw you in that hospital waiting room, you were the first person I'd met in years who seemed real. Everyone in my world wants something from me, but you didn't even know who I was. I still don't, really. I looked up at him. I know the public version, the successful businessman, the eligible bachelor, but I don't know who you actually are. Maybe that's for the best. There was something in his tone that made me want to press, but the song was ending, and people were beginning to leave the dance floor. We should probably mingle, Alexander said, but he didn't immediately let go of my hand. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. I smiled until my cheeks hurt and told our love story so many times, I almost started believing it myself. Alexander never left my side. his hand always finding mine or settling on my back in small gestures of possession that felt increasingly natural. It wasn't until we were in the car heading home that I realized how exhausted I was from playing a role all evening. "You were perfect tonight," Alexander said as he pulled into the circular drive. I felt like everyone could see right through me. Trust me, they couldn't. You were born for this world, Emma. You just don't know it yet. Something in his voice made me look at him more closely. Are you okay? You seemed tense after we talked to Marcus. Alexander was quiet as he turned off the engine. Marcus has been waiting his whole life to inherit grandfather's empire. Learning that I'm married, it changes everything for him. Are you worried he'll try to prove our marriage is fake? Among other things. Alexander's jaw tightened. My cousin isn't someone you want as an enemy. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. What does that mean? It means we need to be very, very careful from now on. As we walked into the house together, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just painted targets on our backs. But when Alexander's hand brushed mine as he said goodnight, all I could think about was how right it had felt to be in his arms on that dance floor. I was in trouble, and it had nothing to do with Marcus. The next morning, I woke up to find a stack of newspapers outside my bedroom door. Every society page in the city featured photos of Alexander and me at the gala, with headlines like Blackwood Heir's Secret Marriage and The Mystery Mrs. Blackwood. In every photo, we looked perfect together, Alexander's hand on my waist, my head tilted toward his as he whispered something in my ear. Both of us smiling like we shared the most wonderful secret in the world. Looking at them, even I almost believed we were a real couple. Good morning. Alexander appeared in my doorway with 2 cups of coffee, already dressed in a charcoal gray suit that made his eyes look silver. I see you found the morning's entertainment. We made quite the splash. I accepted the coffee gratefully. Is this normal? The attention? Unfortunately, yes. The speculation about my love life has been tabloid gold for years. He sat in the chair across from my bed, somehow making even that simple action look elegant. How are you feeling about everything? Overwhelmed? Terrified? Like I'm living someone else's life. I gestured at the opulent room around us. This time yesterday, my biggest concern was whether I could afford groceries this week. And now? Now I'm wondering if your cousin is going to have me investigated, or if I'm going to embarrass you at Sunday brunch with your grandmother. I took a sip of coffee and nearly moaned. It was the best coffee I'd ever tasted. Also, is all your coffee this amazing? Alexander smiled, and I realized it was the first truly relaxed expression I'd seen from him. Mrs. Henderson has very high standards, and for what it's worth, you couldn't embarrass me if you tried. Don't say that. I have a real talent for putting my foot in my mouth. I'll take my chances. He stood to leave, then paused. Emma, thank you for last night, for all of this. I know it's not easy. You're paying me $2 million. I think I can handle a few fancy parties. But as he left, I realized money wasn't the only reason I was doing this anymore. Somewhere between the courthouse wedding and last night's dance, Something had shifted. I was starting to care about Alexander Blackwood, the man, not just Alexander Blackwood, the solution to my problems. And that was dangerous territory indeed. Sunday brunch with Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood was held in the formal dining room of the family estate. The woman who greeted us was tiny but formidable, with silver hair swept into a perfect chignon and eyes that missed nothing. She was wearing a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my car, and pearls that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Grandmother, I'd like you to meet Emma," Alexander said, his hand settling protectively on my lower back. "Mrs. Blackwood, it's an honor to meet you." I offered my hand, hoping my nervousness didn't show. "Call me Eleanor. Dear, we're family now." Her handshake was firm, her gaze assessing. "You're even lovelier than the photographs suggested." "Thank you. Alexander speaks of you often." "Does he?" Eleanor's eyes twinkled with amusement. "All good things, I hope." We settled around the dining table, where Mrs. Henderson served what appeared to be a 5-course brunch. I tried not to gape at the china or the crystal or the fact that there were 3 different forks at my place setting. "So tell me, dear, how did you capture my grandson's heart? He's always been quite the bachelor." I launched into our rehearsed story, but Eleanor's sharp eyes never left my face. I had the distinct feeling she was analyzing every word, every expression, looking for cracks in our facade. "A teacher," she mused when I mentioned my job. "How refreshing. Alexander needs someone who's passionate about something other than money." "I love what I do," I said, and for the first time all morning, I was being completely honest. So there's nothing quite like seeing a child discover they can create something beautiful. "Art is so important," Eleanor agreed. Alexander's mother was an artist. You know, quite talented. She painted the most beautiful landscapes. I glanced at Alexander, who had gone very still beside me. "I didn't know that." "Alexander doesn't talk about his parents much," Eleanor continued, her voice gentle but pointed. "They died when he was 12. Car accident." "I'm so sorry." I reached over instinctively and covered Alexander's hand with mine. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but when his fingers turned to intertwine with mine, something warm and electric shot up my arm. "It was a long time ago," Alexander said quietly, but his grip on my hand tightened. "Family is precious," Eleanor said, watching our joined hands with interest. "We must treasure what we have while we have it." The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but I found myself studying Alexander's profile when he wasn't looking. There was so much I didn't know about him, so much pain hidden behind that polished exterior. "Emma, I understand you've been caring for your mother," Eleanor said during dessert. "How is she doing?" "Much better. Thank you. The treatment is going well." I still couldn't quite believe that was true. Alexander mentioned she's been ill. I'm so glad to hear there's improvement. I looked at Alexander in surprise. When had he mentioned my mother to his grandmother? "Family takes care of family," Eleanor continued. I'm sure Alexander has been a great support during this difficult time. He has, I said, meaning it. Without him, my mother would be dying. I don't know what I would have done without him. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, an expression I couldn't quite read. Well, Eleanor said, setting down her coffee cup with a delicate clink. I must say, you two seem very well suited. There's a natural chemistry between you. Heat rose in my cheeks. Thank you. In fact, Eleanor continued with a slight smile. You remind me very much of myself at your age. I married Alexander's grandfather under somewhat unusual circumstances as well. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. I'm sorry? Oh yes. Our marriage was quite the scandal at the time. I was nobody special, a secretary from a middle-class family. He was heir to a fortune and expected to marry someone from society. But sometimes the heart wants what it wants, regardless of what makes sense on paper. I felt Alexander's eyes on me, but I couldn't look at him. Had Eleanor figured us out, or was she simply sharing family history? How did you know, I asked quietly, that it was real love, despite the circumstances? Eleanor's smile was knowing. Because even when we were pretending for everyone else, we couldn't pretend with each other. Love has a way of revealing itself, dear, no matter how hard we try to hide it. As we drove home in silence, Eleanor's words echoed in my head. Love has a way of revealing itself. But what happened when the love was one-sided? What happened when one person started falling while the other was still just acting? Your grandmother is wonderful, I said finally, needing to break the tension. She likes you. Alexander's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. That's not always easy to achieve. Alexander? I hesitated, then plunged ahead. When you told her about my mother, what exactly did you say? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. I told her that you were going through something difficult and that I wanted to help. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either. No, he admitted. It wasn't. I stared out the window at the passing scenery, processing this new information. Why? Why what? Why tell her anything at all? You could have just said we met at the hospital and left it at that. Alexander pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, but made no move to get out of the car. Because despite what you might think, I'm not completely heartless. What you're going through with your mother, no one should have to face that alone. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tight. Alexander, we should go inside, he said abruptly, cutting off whatever I'd been about to say. I have some work to catch up on. But as we walked into the house together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. The careful distance we'd maintained was starting to crack, and I wasn't sure either of us was prepared for what might happen when it finally broke apart completely. That night, I found myself wandering the halls of the mansion, too restless to sleep. The house was massive and filled with shadows, but somehow I didn't feel afraid. I'd started to think of it as home, which was dangerous thinking for someone who was only going to be here for a year. I turned a corner and nearly ran into Alexander. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt, and his hair was messed up like he'd been running his hands through it. It was the most casual I'd ever seen him, and somehow that made him even more attractive. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much coffee at brunch. I think..." It was a lie. I couldn't sleep because I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hand had felt in mine, or the look in his eyes when his grandmother talked about his parents. "Want some company?" I was just going to the library. I followed him through a set of double doors into the most beautiful room I'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the massive fireplace, and comfortable-looking chairs were scattered around the room. "This is incredible," I breathed, running my fingers along the spine of what looked like a first-edition Dickens. My grandfather's collection. He was a bit of a bibliophile. Alexander settled into one of the chairs by the fire, and I took the one across from him. "Feel free to borrow anything you'd like while you're here." "While you're here." The words were a reminder that this was all temporary, but they stung more than they should have. "Can I ask you something?" I said, pulling my legs up under me in the chair. "Shoot. Why did you really choose me? And don't say it's because I seemed real. There had to be more to it than that." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Do you remember what you were doing when I first saw you in that hospital waiting room?" I tried to think back to that awful day. Crying, probably. Panicking about bills. "You were reading to a little girl. She was maybe 6 or 7, sitting with what I assume was her grandmother. The child was clearly scared, probably there visiting someone. And you saw that. So you sat down next to her and started reading from a picture book you had in your bag." I did remember that. The little girl had been crying, and her grandmother looked exhausted. I'd had a children's book with me that I'd been planning to use for a lesson plan. "You didn't know them," Alexander continued. "You were dealing with your own crisis, but you took the time to comfort a scared child. That's who you are. Emma, that's why I chose you." Something warm bloomed in my chest. "I didn't even know you were watching." I couldn't look away. His gray eyes met mine across the space between our chairs. I'd spent so many years surrounded by people who only saw what I could do for them. But you didn't even know who I was, and you were still exactly who you are at your core. Kind, genuine, beautiful. The last word hung in the air between us, charged with meaning. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, and suddenly the space between our chairs felt like both too much and not enough. "Alexander. I should let you get some sleep," he said abruptly, standing up. "Big day tomorrow. The business dinner. Remember?" Right. The business dinner where I'd have to play the devoted wife again. Of course not. But as he reached the door, he paused. "Emma, what my grandmother said today about love revealing itself. She's usually right about these things." He was gone before I could ask what he meant, leaving me alone by the fire with my heart racing and my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. The business dinner was held at an exclusive restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the menu didn't have prices and everyone spoke in hushed, reverent tones. Alexander looked devastating in a navy suit, and I wore a black cocktail dress that the stylist had insisted made my eyes look bigger. "Remember," Alexander murmured as we walked in, "tonight is about securing the Henderson account. They're old-fashioned, very family-oriented. The fact that I'm married now actually works in our favor." "No pressure," I said with a nervous laugh. "You'll be perfect. Just be yourself." James Henderson turned out to be a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a warm handshake. His wife Margaret was elegant and gracious, and they both seemed genuinely pleased to meet me. "Alexander, you've been holding out on us," James said as we settled at our table. "I had no idea you were married." "We kept things quiet," Alexander replied smoothly. "Emma's not fond of the spotlight." "Wise girl," Margaret said with approval. "The society pages can be vicious." As the evening progressed, I found myself actually enjoying the conversation. The Hendersons were easy to talk to, asking genuine questions about my teaching and my art. Alexander's hand found mine on the table, his thumb stroking over my knuckles in a gesture that felt more natural than it should have. "You know," James said over dessert, "it's refreshing to see Alexander so settled. He seems different, happier, more grounded." "Marriage changes a man," Margaret agreed. "For the better, in most cases." I felt Alexander's eyes on me, but when I looked at him, his expression was unreadable. "Emma's had that effect on me," he said quietly. "She makes me want to be better." The sincerity in his voice made my breath catch. This was supposed to be acting, but it felt like the most honest thing either of us had said all evening. "How wonderful," Margaret sighed. "Young love is such a beautiful thing." Later, as we waited for the valet to bring Alexander's car, I tried to process what had happened at dinner. The easy conversation, the natural way Alexander and I had moved around each other, the moments when our act had felt more real than anything else in my life. "That went well," Alexander said as we drove home. "I think we impressed them." "Is that what matters? Impressing people? In my world? Usually." He glanced at me. "Why?" When you said I made you want to be better, did you mean that? Or was it part of the performance?" Alexander was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "What do you think?" "I think this is getting complicated." "Yeah," he agreed. "It is." We pulled into the driveway, but neither of us made any move to get out of the car. The air between us felt charged, full of things we weren't saying. "Emma," Alexander said finally, "there's something I need to tell you." My heart started pounding. "What?" "This morning, I got a call from my lawyer. Marcus is asking questions about our marriage. He's hired a private investigator." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "What kind of questions?" "When we met, how long we dated, whether anyone can verify our relationship before the wedding." Alexander's jaw was tight. "He's looking for proof that this is fake. And if he finds it, then I lose everything, and you're probably looking at fraud charges." I stared at him in horror. "Fraud charges? Alexander, you never said anything about..." I didn't think it would come to this. I thought Marcus would be angry, but I didn't think he'd actually try to prove the marriage was fake. So what do we do? Alexander turned in his seat to face me fully. We make it real. Or at least, we make it look so real that no investigator in the world could prove otherwise. What does that mean, exactly? It means we can't live like roommates anymore. We need to share a bedroom, go out on dates, act like a couple even when we think no one is watching. Because someone is always watching now. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. Share a bedroom, act like a couple, pretend to be in love when I was starting to fear it wasn't pretense anymore. I know it's a lot to ask, Alexander continued. If you want out, I understand. I can pay for the best lawyers. Make sure nothing comes back on you. No. The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended. I'm not running out on you. We're in this together. Relief flooded his features. Are you sure? I thought about my mother, getting stronger every day because of the treatment his money had made possible. I thought about Alexander at dinner tonight, the way he'd looked at me when he said I made him want to be better. I thought about Eleanor's words. Sometimes the heart wants what it wants. I'm sure. Alexander's hand found mine in the darkness of the car. Thank you. As we walked into the house together, I tried to ignore the voice in my head pointing out that sharing a bedroom with Alexander Blackwood was either going to be the best idea I'd ever had, or it was going to completely destroy me. Probably both. Moving into Alexander's bedroom felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. The room was enormous, decorated in deep blues and grays, with a king-sized bed that somehow still seemed too small for both of us to navigate around without awkward moments. I can sleep on the couch, Alexander offered as we stood in the middle of the room with my hastily packed suitcase between us. Don't be ridiculous. We're both adults. I tried to sound more confident than I felt. Besides, if we're being watched, separate sleeping arrangements would be suspicious. Right, of course. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of his nerves. The bathroom is all yours first. I have some calls to make. As I went through my nighttime routine, I caught glimpses of myself in the massive mirror above the marble vanity. I looked pale and nervous, like someone who was about to make a colossal mistake. But when I thought about backing out now, leaving Alexander to face Marcus's investigation alone, my stomach clenched with something that felt suspiciously like panic. When I emerged from the bathroom in my modest cotton pajamas, Alexander was sitting on the edge of the bed in dark blue pajama pants and no shirt. I tried not to stare at the expanse of his chest, the way the muscles moved under his skin as he set his phone on the nightstand. Everything okay? I asked, climbing into my side of the bed and trying to act like this was perfectly normal. Just work stuff. He settled back against the pillows, careful to stay on his side of the invisible line that divided the massive bed. Emma? Yeah? Thank you for not running when things got complicated. I turned onto my side to face him, struck by how young he looked in the dim light from the bedside lamp. Why would I run? Because most people do, when my life gets messy, and it always gets messy. Eventually. There was something in his voice, a vulnerability I'd never heard before, that made my chest tight. "I'm not most people." "No," he said softly. "You're not." We lay there in the semi-darkness, the space between us feeling both vast and impossibly small. I was hyper-aware of every sound he made, every shift of the mattress, the soft rhythm of his breathing. "Alexander," I whispered. What was she like, your mother?" He was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with old pain. "She was like you, actually. An artist, but more than that. She saw beauty in everything, found ways to make ordinary moments feel magical. She used to set up easels in the garden and paint for hours, and I'd sit next to her and try to see what she saw. She sounds wonderful. She was. She and my father, they were crazy about each other. Even as a kid, I could see it. The way they looked at each other. The way they'd dance in the kitchen when they thought I wasn't watching." His voice grew softer. "I used to think everyone's parents were like that. It wasn't until I got older that I realized how rare it was." "Is that why you've never married? Because you were waiting for something like what they had?" Alexander turned onto his side to face me, and suddenly we were much closer than before. Close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Maybe. Or maybe I just never found anyone worth the risk. "What risk?" "Losing them." His voice was barely a whisper. "To loving someone that much, and then having them taken away. I watched what it did to my grandfather when my grandmother died. He was never the same. My heart broke a little for the 12-year-old boy who'd lost everything, who'd grown up believing that love meant inevitable loss. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his face, my fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "Not everyone leaves," I said softly. Alexander's eyes closed at my touch, and for a moment, he leaned into my palm like a man starved for affection. "Don't they? I'm still here. For now." The words hung between us, a reminder of the temporary nature of our arrangement. But lying there in the darkness, with his skin warm under my touch and his eyes searching mine, the idea of leaving felt impossible. "Alexander, we should get some sleep," he said abruptly, pulling back from my touch. "Tomorrow's going to be another long day." He rolled over, turning his back to me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my hand still tingling from where I'd touched his face, wondering how I'd gotten to the point where a fake marriage felt more real than anything else in my life, and wondering what I was going to do when it was time to give it up. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt dangerously domestic. Alexander and I had breakfast together each morning, discussing our schedules and the various events we needed to attend. We went to charity galas and business dinners, gallery openings and dinner parties, playing the part of the happy couple with increasing ease, and every night, we shared that massive bed, lying carefully on our respective sides while the space between us seemed to shrink a little more each day. The investigation was ongoing, but Marcus's private investigator hadn't found anything concrete yet. Alexander's lawyers were confident our story would hold up. especially since we were doing such a convincing job of acting like a real couple. Acting. That's what I kept telling myself, even as the lines between performance and reality became increasingly blurred. "There's something I want to show you," Alexander said one Saturday morning over breakfast. He led me through parts of the house I'd never seen before, down a hallway lined with family portraits. At the end of the hall, he opened a door to reveal a room that took my breath away. It was an art studio, flooded with natural light from massive windows. Easels stood at various points around the room, and one wall was covered with paintings in different stages of completion. They were beautiful, landscapes mostly, filled with color and life and a kind of joy that seemed to radiate from the canvas. "Your mother's studio," I said, understanding immediately. "I had it restored last year. Mrs. Henderson had kept it exactly as it was when..." He cleared his throat. "I thought you might like to use it while you're here." I turned to stare at him. "Alexander, I can't. This is sacred space." She would have wanted it to be used. Art was meant to be shared, she always said. His gray eyes were soft as they met mine. "Besides, I think she would have liked you." I walked slowly around the room, running my fingers over the brushes and paints, feeling the ghost of the woman who'd created in this space. There was an unfinished painting on one of the easels, a garden scene that looked like it could have been painted from one of the windows. "She was working on this when she died?" I asked softly. "Yes. I've always wondered what it would have looked like finished." Something about the unfinished painting tugged at my heart. The composition was beautiful, the colors warm and inviting, but it felt incomplete, like a story with missing pages. "Would you..." I hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Would you mind if I tried to finish it? I mean, I'm nowhere near as talented as she was, but I think she'd love that," Alexander said quietly. So I began spending my afternoons in the studio, working on the painting and trying to channel the spirit of the woman who'd started it. It was presumptuous, maybe, but it felt like the right thing to do. Like I was completing something that needed completion. Alexander would sometimes join me, sitting in the window seat with his laptop, working while I painted. We'd talk about everything and nothing, books we'd read, places we wanted to travel, childhood memories, both good and bad. It felt peaceful, domestic, real in a way that scared me. "You know," he said one afternoon, watching me blend colors on the palette, "you're incredibly talented." "I'm adequate," I corrected. "Your mother was talented. You're both talented in different ways. Her work was about capturing beauty. Yours is about creating it." I looked up from the canvas to find him watching me with an expression that made my pulse skip. "What do you mean?" "I mean you take broken things and make them whole again. That little girl in the hospital waiting room. This house, which has felt more like a home in the past month than it has in 20 years. Me." My breath caught. "Alexander." "I know this is complicated," he said, standing up and moving closer to where I stood by the easel. "I know we agreed this was just business, but somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like pretense." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "For me too." He was standing close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, could smell the cologne that I'd come to associate with safety and home. "Emma," he said softly, reaching up to touch my face the way I'd touched his that first night. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between us, honest and terrifying and beautiful. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering closed. "I think I'm falling in love with you too." When he kissed me, it was nothing like the brief, formal kiss at our wedding. This was soft and sweet and desperate, like he was trying to pour months of carefully contained feelings into a single moment. I kissed him back with everything I had, my hands fisting in his shirt, my heart soaring with the knowledge that this was real. This was happening. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against mine. "This changes everything," he said. "I know. The contract, the arrangement. None of that matters anymore. I know. Emma." His voice was rough with emotion. "I need you to know that whatever happens with the inheritance, with Marcus's investigation, with any of it, this is real. What I feel for you is real. I know." I whispered again, because it was true. Whatever else was uncertain, this was the most real thing I'd ever experienced. He kissed me again, and this time I let myself fall completely, knowing that there was no going back from this moment. We'd crossed a line from fake to real, from business arrangement to something that felt like forever. But as we stood there in his mother's studio, surrounded by her unfinished dreams, I couldn't shake the feeling that our own story was about to take a turn that would test everything we'd just discovered. The call came 3 days later, while I was putting the finishing touches on the garden painting. Alexander answered his phone with a terse "Blackwood," but his expression grew increasingly dark as he listened. "When?" he asked sharply. "How much does he know?" I set down my brush, my stomach clenching with dread. "Fine. Set up the meeting for Monday." Alexander hung up and turned to me, his face grim. "That was my lawyer. Marcus thinks he's found something." "What kind of something?" "He knows about the hospital. He knows I was there the day before we met, not visiting a friend like we said, but meeting with a private investigator about finding someone to marry." My blood ran cold. "He has proof. He has the investigator's records. But more than that." Alexander's jaw tightened. "He's found Sarah." "My Sarah?" I stood up so quickly I knocked over my easel. "What does Sarah have to do with anything?" "Marcus knows you told your best friend that you got a loan from a private investor to pay for your mother's treatment. He's threatening to subpoena her, to put her under oath and ask her exactly what you told her about where the money came from." The room seemed to tilt around me. Sarah didn't know about the marriage arrangement, but she did know there was no private investor. She knew I'd been desperate and broke and then suddenly had millions of dollars. If she was forced to testify. "How long do we have?" "Marcus has called a family meeting for Monday. He's going to present his evidence to the Board of Trustees and demand they invalidate my inheritance claim. And if they do, then I lose everything. And you?" "Emma," You could be looking at serious criminal charges. Fraud, maybe conspiracy. My lawyer says we might be able to work out a plea deal. But no, I cut him off, my mind racing. There has to be another way. There is. Alexander's voice was quiet, defeated. We end this now. We get divorced. You disappear. And I take whatever Marcus dishes out. At least that way. You're protected. I stared at him in shock. You want to divorce me? I want to protect you. Alexander exploded, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Don't you understand? This is exactly what I was afraid of. Everyone I care about gets hurt because of who I am, because of my family, because of this damn money. So you're just going to give up? Let Marcus win? If it keeps you safe, yes. The certainty in his voice broke something inside me. After everything we'd shared, everything we'd discovered about each other, he was still willing to throw it all away to protect me. But I wasn't willing to let him. No, I said firmly. Emma, be reasonable. No, I repeated, stepping closer to him. You don't get to make this decision for both of us. You don't get to decide that I'm better off without you. You are better off without me, Alexander said bitterly. Look what knowing me has done to your life. You're facing potential criminal charges because of me. I'm facing criminal charges because I chose to marry you for money, I corrected. That was my decision, my choice. And do you know what? I'd make the same choice again. Even knowing what you know now, especially knowing what I know now. I reached up and cupped his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. Because yes, I married you for money. But I fell in love with you for 100 other reasons, and I'm not giving that up without a fight. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Hope, maybe. Or just the desire to believe. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we beat Marcus at his own game. He wants to prove our marriage is fake. Fine. Let's give him a story so convincing, so airtight, that no one could ever doubt it. How? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding with the audacity of what I was about to suggest. We tell them the truth, the whole truth. Alexander frowned. Emma, that's exactly what we can't do. No, listen. Marcus has proof that you hired an investigator to find someone to marry. But he doesn't have proof of what happened after that investigator found me. Understanding began to dawn in Alexander's eyes. You mean? I mean, we tell them that yes, you hired someone to find you a wife. But when that investigator led you to me, when you saw me in that hospital waiting room, you fell in love. The marriage wasn't fake. It was just unconventional. Do you think anyone would believe that? Your grandmother would. She already suspects, I think. And Mrs. Henderson definitely knows something real is happening between us. Even the Hendersons commented on how happy you seemed. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering. It's risky. Everything worthwhile is risky. If it doesn't work, then we face the consequences together. I stood on my tiptoes and kissed him softly. But if it does work, we get to keep this. We get to keep each other. Alexander's arms came around me, holding me tight against his chest. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. As he held me in his mother's studio, surrounded by paintings full of love and life and hope, I tried to believe that love really could conquer all. Even Marcus Blackwood's greed and manipulation. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terrified of what Monday would bring. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. Alexander and I had spent the weekend with his lawyers, crafting our story and preparing for every possible question. The plan was simple: tell the truth about how we met, but emphasize the love story that developed afterward. The family meeting was being held in the boardroom of Blackwood Industries, a glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. As we rode up in the elevator, Alexander's hand found mine. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these past few months have been the happiest of my life. Don't talk like this is goodbye." I squeezed his hand. "We're going to get through this." But when the elevator doors opened and I saw the people gathered in the conference room, my confidence wavered. Marcus was there, of course, looking smug and self-satisfied. There was an older woman I didn't recognize who had the same sharp features as Alexander, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who was probably another family member, and several people who looked like lawyers. And at the head of the table, straight-backed and formidable, sat Eleanor Blackwood. "Alexander," she said as we entered. "Emma, please, sit." We took seats across from Marcus, and I tried not to notice the thick folder of documents in front of him. "I think we all know why we're here," Eleanor continued. "Marcus has made some serious allegations about the validity of Alexander's marriage. I think it's time we heard what he has to say." Marcus stood, his smile sharp and unpleasant. "Thank you, Grandmother. As you know, Alexander's inheritance is contingent upon him being married before his 30th birthday. What I've discovered is that this marriage is nothing but an elaborate fraud." Chusiki, he opened his folder and began laying out documents. "This is a contract between Alexander and a private investigator, dated 2 days before his wedding, requesting help finding someone willing to enter into a marriage of convenience." My heart sank. There it was, in black and white. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "the woman Alexander married was in desperate financial straits. Her mother was dying. She had no money for treatment. And then suddenly, coincidentally, just after marrying Alexander, she was able to afford experimental therapy costing millions of dollars." "That's not," I started to say, but Alexander's lawyer held up a hand. "Let him finish," she murmured. Finally, Marcus pulled out what looked like phone records. "I have evidence that Alexander and Emma barely knew each other before their marriage. No shared friends, no history, no evidence of any relationship whatsoever." He sat back down, looking triumphant. "The marriage is a sham, designed solely to allow Alexander to claim his inheritance. I move that the board declare it invalid and transfer all assets to me, as the next legitimate heir." The room was silent except for the soft sound of rain against the windows. I felt like I might be sick. "Those are serious allegations," Eleanor said finally. "Alexander, How do you respond? Alexander stood slowly, his face calm despite the storm I knew was raging inside him. Marcus is right about some of the facts, but wrong about their meaning. He turned to address the room, but his eyes kept finding mine. It's true that I hired an investigator. After grandfather's will was read, I realized I had 6 months to find someone to marry or lose everything our family had built. I was desperate, and I made a desperate decision. My heart sank. He was going to confess everything. The investigator I hired was supposed to find me someone who would agree to a business arrangement. Someone who needed money and would be willing to enter into a marriage of convenience. Alexander's voice was steady, but I could see his hands trembling slightly. But that's not what happened. He looked directly at me, and something in his expression made my breath catch. What happened was that I fell in love. A murmur went around the room. Marcus's face darkened. The investigator led me to Emma, and yes, she was in a desperate situation. Her mother was dying, and she had no way to pay for treatment. But when I saw her in that hospital waiting room, reading to a frightened child who wasn't even related to her, I knew I'd found something I hadn't even been looking for. Alexander moved to stand behind my chair, his hands settling on my shoulders. I offered Emma the business arrangement because it was all I thought I could offer. But what developed between us was real. Our marriage might have started as a contract, but it became something else entirely. How convenient, Marcus said sarcastically. And I suppose you have proof of this great love affair. Actually, said a voice from the doorway. We do. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Henderson entering the room, carrying a manila envelope. Behind her was James Henderson, looking serious but determined. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor said in surprise. Mr. Henderson, what are you doing here? Forgive the intrusion, James said. But when I heard about these allegations, I felt compelled to speak on Alexander and Emma's behalf. Mrs. Henderson handed the envelope to Eleanor. Those are photographs, ma'am, from security cameras throughout the house over the past few months. Eleanor opened the envelope and began looking through the photos. Her expression grew softer with each image. What kind of photographs? Alexander asked, clearly as surprised as I was. The kind that show a couple in love, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. Alexander bringing Emma coffee in bed every morning. The two of you dancing in the kitchen when you thought no one was watching. Emma crying in Alexander's arms when her mother had a setback. Alexander carrying Emma to bed when she fell asleep reading in the library. My cheeks burned. I had no idea we'd been captured in all those private moments. These photos span the entire length of your marriage, James added. They show a clear progression from polite strangers to people who are obviously in love. No one is that good of an actor. Eleanor was studying the photos intently. These are quite compelling. They're meaningless, Marcus protested. Anyone can stage a few romantic moments. Can they? Eleanor held up one of the photos. It showed Alexander and me in his mother's studio. Paint on my hands and clothes. His arms around me as we looked at the canvas together. This was taken last week. No one knew you were being watched. The expression on your face. Alexander. When you look at Emma. It's the same expression your father had when he looked at your mother. My heart stopped. Alexander's hands tightened on my shoulders. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, I've had my own investigators looking into this marriage. Do you know what they found? Marcus? Marcus's confident expression faltered slightly. What? They found that while Emma initially told her friend she'd gotten a loan to pay for her mother's treatment, she later corrected that story. She told her friend she'd met someone who offered to help, and that she was falling in love with him. I stared at Eleanor in shock. How could you possibly know that? Because I spoke to Sarah myself, Eleanor said with a slight smile. Lovely girl, very protective of you. She told me that she was initially worried you were being taken advantage of, but that when she saw you and Alexander together, she could see you were genuinely happy. Marcus was starting to look panicked. This is all circumstantial, is it? Eleanor pulled out one more document. This is a letter. Marcus. Written by Emma to Alexander but never sent. She dropped it in the garden last week, and the groundskeeper found it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I remembered writing that letter, pouring my heart out about how confused I was, how I was falling in love despite every rational thought in my head. I'd written it, but never had the courage to give it to him. Would you like me to read it aloud? Eleanor asked. No, I said quickly, mortified. Please don't. Eleanor smiled. The letter makes it very clear that Emma's feelings for Alexander are genuine and completely separate from any financial arrangement. In fact, she spends several paragraphs agonizing over whether those feelings invalidate their original agreement. Alexander's hand found mine, squeezing gently. Emma, you wrote me a letter? A letter I was too scared to give you, I admitted, my cheeks burning. The point is, Eleanor said, bringing the attention back to the matter at hand, that this marriage may have begun as a business arrangement, but it has clearly become something real. The board has two choices. We can focus on the technicalities of how this marriage began, or we can focus on what it has become. She stood, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Alexander, do you love Emma? More than I ever thought possible, he said without hesitation. Emma, do you love Alexander? I looked around the room at all the faces watching me, then up at Alexander. Yes, I love him completely. Then this marriage is real in every way that matters, Eleanor declared. And I move that Alexander's inheritance claim be upheld. I second that motion, James Henderson said immediately. The vote was swift and decisive. Even faced with Marcus's evidence, the board chose to recognize our marriage as valid. Love, it seemed, had won the day. As the room cleared and people began filing out, Marcus stopped by our table. His face was dark with anger and something that might have been grudging respect. This isn't over, he said quietly. Yes, it is, Alexander replied. Find your own path. Marcus, stop trying to steal mine. When we were finally alone in the conference room, Alexander pulled me into his arms. I can't believe we did it. I breathed against his chest. I can't believe you wrote me a letter. I pulled back to look at him. I can't believe your grandmother found it and used it as evidence. I can't believe a lot of things about my grandmother, Alexander said with a laugh. But I'm grateful for all of them. He cupped my face in his hands, his gray eyes serious. Emma, about the letter. I want to read it. Not because I need proof of how you feel, but because I want to know every thought you've had about us. It's embarrassing. It's honest. And I love your honesty. As we left the building together, hand in hand, I felt lighter than I had in months. The inheritance was secure. Our marriage was recognized as real. And for the first time, I could truly believe that our love story might have a happy ending. But as we walked out into the New York afternoon, I caught a glimpse of Marcus watching us from across the street, his expression promising that this victory might be temporary. For now, though, I chose to focus on the man beside me, on the love we'd found in the most unlikely circumstances, and on the fact that sometimes fairy tales could happen in real life. 6 months later, I was putting the finishing touches on my first solo art exhibition when Alexander appeared in the gallery doorway with a bouquet of white roses. "How's the artist feeling?" he asked, crossing the room to kiss me softly. Nervous, excited, terrified. I gestured at the paintings lining the walls. I still can't believe people actually want to buy my work. I can. You're incredibly talented. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the garden painting I'd finished in his mother's studio. It had sold within an hour of the gallery opening, to a collector who said it captured something ineffable about hope and new beginnings. "Any word from the lawyer?" I asked as Alexander helped me hang the last piece. Marcus dropped the appeal. "Officially, we're in the clear." Relief flooded through me. For months, Marcus had been trying to find new angles to challenge our marriage, but his legal options had finally run out. And unofficially, I think he's finally accepted that he lost. Alexander's arms came around me from behind. Eleanor made him a generous settlement offer, enough to start his own company, build his own empire. Sometimes people just need to find their own path. Do you think he'll take it? I hope so. For his sake as much as ours. The gallery opening that night was a huge success. Half of New York society seemed to be there, along with my friends and family. My mother was there, healthy and radiant after beating her cancer, charming everyone she met with stories about her daughter, the famous artist. "I always knew she was talented," she told Eleanor, who had become one of my biggest supporters. "But I never imagined she'd end up living in a mansion and married to the most eligible bachelor in the city." "Former most eligible bachelor," Alexander corrected, slipping his arm around my waist. "I'm very much off the market." As the evening wound down and the last guests filtered out, I found myself alone with Alexander in the now empty gallery, surrounded by my paintings and the life we'd built together. "So," I said, settling into his arms. "Any regrets about hiring that private investigator?" "Only that it took me so long to admit I was falling in love with you." "When did you know? Really know?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Do you remember the night you found me in the library, when we talked about my parents?" "Yes. That night, when you touched my face and told me not everyone leaves. I knew then I was terrified of it. But I knew. I knew that night too, I admitted. I wanted to comfort you, but it felt like so much more than that. What about now? Any regrets about marrying a stranger for money? I pretended to consider the question seriously. Well, the money was nice, and the mansion is growing on me. But I think the best part of the deal was falling in love with my husband. Just falling in love? Past tense? Fine. I laughed. Being in love with my husband. Present tense, ongoing, probably forever. Forever sounds good to me. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart skipped a beat. Emma, I know we're already married, but we never got to do things the right way. We never got the proposal, the choice, the chance to say yes because we wanted to and not because we needed to. He dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by my paintings and the evidence of the life we'd built together. Emma Catherine Sullivan Blackwood, will you marry me? Again? For real this time? With our families watching and our hearts fully engaged and absolutely no contracts or business arrangements involved? Tears were streaming down my cheeks as I looked down at the man who'd saved my mother's life, and then somehow saved mine too. Yes, I whispered. Yes. Of course. Yes. The ring he slipped onto my finger was different from the simple band I'd been wearing. This one was vintage, with a brilliant diamond surrounded by smaller stones in an intricate setting. It was my grandmother's, Alexander said as he stood and pulled me into his arms. Eleanor wanted you to have it. It's perfect. You're perfect. As he kissed me in the empty gallery, surrounded by art and love and the promise of our real future together, I thought about how strange life could be, how a fake marriage could become the most real thing in your life, how a business arrangement could turn into a love story, and how sometimes the best beginnings started with endings, the end of who you thought you were, and the beginning of who you were meant to become. So, I said when we finally broke apart, when should we have this second wedding? How about next month? I've waited long enough to marry you properly. Next month sounds perfect. As we walked out of the gallery hand in hand, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that our love story had started with a lie, but was ending with the most fundamental truth of all. That love, real love, was worth any risk, any complication, any challenge life could throw at you. Because in the end, love wasn't about contracts or arrangements or what made logical sense. Love was about finding someone who saw all your broken pieces and chose to stay anyway. Someone who made you want to be brave enough to believe in happy endings. And as Alexander helped me into the car and we drove home to our mansion, to our life, to our future together, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. After all, we'd already proven that love could conquer anything, even the most impossible circumstances. Some stories end with happily ever after. Ours ended with happily ever after, for real this time, and that made all the difference. 1 year later, the second wedding was everything our first one wasn't. Full of flowers and family, laughter, and tears of joy. As I walked down the aisle in my grandmother's wedding dress, toward Alexander waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes, I thought about how far we'd come from that desperate day in the hospital when a stranger had offered me an impossible solution to an impossible problem. Now, as I said I do for the second time, I wasn't agreeing to a business arrangement. I was choosing love, choosing forever, choosing the man who had become my everything. And when the minister pronounced us husband and wife again, and Alexander kissed me with all the love and joy and promise in the world, I knew that our real story was just beginning. Because the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people choosing each other again and again, every single day. And that's exactly what we plan to do, forever.